You're listening to the 4-Phase Cycle podcast with your hosts, Dr. Alex and Megan of ZESTY Ginger. If you're looking to naturally balance hormones and learn how to work with your body instead of against it, you've definitely come to the right place. As a duo of an integrative MD and a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner and best friends, we use the 4 phases of the female cycle in combination with functional lab work and mindset practices to transform the lives of the women we work with.
We also have a whole lot of fun along the way. If you're new around here, it's best to start with season 1 before jumping around and plan to roll up your sleeves. Showing up for ourselves and enjoying our lives is what good health is all about. Just a quick reminder though, this information is not intended to diagnose, manage, or treat disease. Always consult with your doctor before making changes.
Hello, Alex here for part 2 of a 4-part series that I'm doing about my story and how my relationship with supplements changed over my life so far. And I'm sure I'll keep going, so who knows how many parts this will have one day. But right now, we have finished part 1, and that was where I talked about how I even got into supplements and what my experience with that was, going from conventional medicine, feeling like I wasn't getting any answers, feeling like I had very little support, feeling like I had very few options, and then going down the rabbit hole of what does herbal and mineral therapy look like and how does that work and all of that. So from there, we focused on, kind of what was left at the end, because this was a while ago, right, as you listen to that. And then part 2, today what we're going to transition to talking about is how that became much more intentional. So I kind of went from supplement junkie and kind of having like a supplement hoarder situation because I was reading about things, learning, and then trying it, and I didn't have a whole lot of understanding and background and all of that. Now, granted, I did learn a lot, so you'll hear about all of this. And then some of this stuff really has stuck around. And so you'll hear how even from way back when, even when it looked very different from how Megan and I live now and make choices now, some of the stuff really did launch me into a very cool understanding of some of those options and built out some very important foundations for me. And so today then I'm going to be transitioning to talking about how that became much more targeted and much more intentional. So this whole series too is kind of in celebration of the Full Script Cyber Monday deal that they have going on. That's an extra 20% off. And because we know how much supplements, not only the decision making around it, but also the investment in them, that's not a small thing. And we don't just say that because we're healthcare providers, but having done it ourselves, and especially when you're just sort of like reading about stuff and trying it and then being like, oh, did that even work, right? All of that, it gets really expensive. So we don't mess around with supplements. Then there's a couple of things there. So in our full script, that's why we participate in that. We have a standing 15% off because of that, right? And then they're doing, Full Script itself is doing an additional Cyber Monday deal. So to get signed up for that, it's zestyginger.com/zestyfullscript. All one word. It's also going to be in the show notes, zestyginger.com/zestyfullscript, all one word. The other part of that is that you'll really hear how when you start to be able to tailor down and sort of understand why the supplements gets used in that way, then it's much easier to sort of say, here's something that I can look at, a formulary, because that's all the stuff that Megan and I use and we use inside our group programs, right? It's then tailored down a lot further than just Googling it, right? And so we really, really like that kind of thing. And Full Script itself we really like just because they're a very sort of aware company of this is how we're bringing it together for people. And I actually fought Megan on ordering my own stuff from Full Script because I always was so impatient. Back in the day, I'd be like, I don't want to order it. Like, I don't want to wait for it. I'll just go pick it up. But man, I will say with that 15% off and for everything and for the automatic refills that you can do with some of the stuff, I've definitely become a convert. So we very, very much, that's the only place I get stuff now. And so you can see how everything goes together there by following the link. So that is active this week. And then, of course, as people stick around, that is where the kind of constant 15% off really kicks in well too. So I know I appreciate that myself. All right, so that's why we're talking about supplements, just as a thing. But this is a series that I wanted to do for a while now because supplements people get really, really, really into, right? And there's lots of potential there. And I think that's absolutely true. However, when it's like with conventional medicine, if that's at the expense of all the other aspects of who we are and our health and our life, there's some missteps that are common, and Meg and I certainly made them, and we see them kind of happen over and over again for people. And so really that becomes the reason that we wanted to talk about this so much. All right, so for part 2, intentionality and testing, right? This became understanding my body for me enough that then I was able to tailor things and not just, oh, this is good for PCOS, or oh, this is good for ovarian reserve, or oh, this is good for blood sugar, which there's some of those and they're very effective. And, if you understand, cool. However, there's a lot of stuff out there that, it can be great for one person, but doesn't apply to everyone. However, when you're reading an article about that, how would you know, right? And that's exactly where I was. So at some point, as I was moving along, where you had heard in part 1, I was getting worse still, right? So I was learning a lot. I was changing a lot in terms of who I ultimately have become now. But health-wise, I was not doing so hot, right? And eventually, I had switched career paths. I finished up as a piano performance major. I had been taking extra classes to get that done, doing some summer classes, worked for a while at a university, and then went to medical school, and I was cruising along there. Though, as you can imagine, it's hard to sort of peel apart what was the natural trajectory of how my health would have gone by itself, and also what did the stress and the lifestyle of medical school and residency and training and all of that contribute. And so I don't really know the answer, right? I don't know the percentages, but long story short, things were a little rocky. And because of that, I began to think a little bit more closely about kind of every way that I was approaching. And during this time in life, I really realized how much I wasn't necessarily taking responsibility for some of the stuff that was happening in my health. And what I mean by that is that, let's say I was looking up like a place I wanted to go travel, I'd be like online reading like reviews and learning about it and looking at pictures and all that stuff. But especially when I was in college, for me, going to a doctor, I was like, oh, where, who's nearby? What is my insurance, recommending or whatever? And I would do it that way. And so during this part of my life, I realized I was like, I'll spend more time yelping like a travel destination than taking care of my own body. And I realized just how backwards that was, right? So that was where I was like, I'm going to be very intentional about, even before I show up to an appointment, I have read about the provider. I have looked into what do they have online, what do they have they written a book, what do they specialize in. And then I would even call the clinic, talk to their nurse, and I'd have 1 to 3 questions, nothing crazy, nothing aggressive, right? I'm just, how do they see this type of patient? How do they tend to help that patient, right? And just kind of very politely, nicely interacting and getting more info before I even came to the appointment. So that even independent of supplements, began to change a lot for me. And because I started doing that, I started seeing providers who were more geared for what I had going on, and their clinic was set up in a way to actually provide services that addressed it. And most of them were doing things a little bit differently, but I wouldn't even say this is not where I went like full crunchy, because I was still going to different OBGYNs. I found a really phenomenal reproductive endocrinologist. And she became my mentor in medical school, and so that is how I began to be more intentional about everything. And because of that, as I started working in the providers, that is where I started to see that lab work and really understanding why you're ordering what you're ordering, what information that's going to give you, how it's going to guide decision making, had everything to do with then the choices that followed. Because in the past, my experience had been, oh, hey, you have XYZ, here's birth control, right? So nothing seemed terribly tailored, because it was like birth control for everything. Oh, my friend had acne, it's the same thing. Oh, my friend had this, it's the same thing, right? So, and that's not to say it can't be like that. Just personally, because I wasn't getting the results I wanted, I was like, there's something a little funky here. So then I started going to people who would really talk me through, here's what I want to know about what's happening under the hood. And here's how getting this very specific information is going to help us do that and guide that. It certainly wasn't what you see me doing today, which is presumably why I'm here on the planet, but right, but I saw that and I thought, oh wow, that is how I want to do things. Right, so then I started having a lot more information. So for example, for my hormones, I mapped out multiple cycles of what my hormones were doing throughout there. Now, these days you don't need to do it the way that I did, because there's much more sophisticated ways to do that. But for me at that point, to really realize how much my cycle changed and my hormones changed over the month, and then to see it mapped out compared to what is kind of the standard, and then how I deviated, gave me a huge amount of information that was very specific to me. And that is where I really began to uncover this idea that even though I was having hormone related stuff and it was my pelvis that was having a problem, and of course I had learned about chronic pain as a central nervous system dysfunction, but then to really put it back together and have these labs that showed me it was my hypothalamus and my brain telling my hormonal system, don't make that. We are not in a place to have this type of thing. We're not in the thriving state. We are in the surviving state. We're inflamed. There's a lot going on. We're working on things in the back end. And all of the supplements I was throwing at it, right? They were probably great, and that's why Megan and I, it's not like we're down on supplements, right? There's a lot of stuff. It's just that it wasn't applicable for me because I couldn't out supplement my own brain. And that's literally why we have podcast episodes called that. And so I began to have a much deeper understanding of what I was even dealing with and how it played out in my symptoms month by month. And this period of life then, it started to merge into the time when I realized that my ovarian reserve was low. We were doing some things for that. There were some issues there. Again, that's how I ended up here. However, that and having surgery and going through IVF and things like that, I began to have more and more merging of realizing that's how labs work. And then over the years that followed, and this whole part of phase 2, then I got to find things like neurogistics, which is the brain chemistry testing we use, and the Dutch test, the dried urine test for comprehensive hormones, that addresses, everything from starts at the hypothalamus, then what did the adrenal ovaries make, and then how did it all get broken down. So I really parlayed that little seed of inspiration that said, how do I use the tools that we have to get to the answers of what's happening and getting a clear understanding of what physiologically is occurring in the body, and then saying, out of everything that we know, how did we get here? And therefore, how can we back the truck up and support every single part of the chain so that it can be optimized, and therefore the body doesn't have to keep giving you those symptoms, right? Symptoms are just a way of communicating that something is going on, and you begin to come out of it. So this really morphed over the years of this time, but more and more and more, I was very, very interested and saw very clearly how much this impacted my own health. So, for example, some of the things that you hear us talking about all the time, for example, are lion's mane and holy basil. So, to my point of what was happening with my hypothalamic blunting, is that the hypothalamus was listening to everything else going on, going, yeah, we're not going to put her at risk for making a whole new person. We're not going to focus on great energy, great libido, great skin, great hair, because like we're trying to live, right? And that's what it was trying to do. And thank goodness. Now, it was only when I had that understanding that I could actually even appreciate that, because I was actually being a little bit of a snoot about it, being like, why is my body not responding right? And I was resentful about it. But really, once I understood that, I was like, wow, the system has been keeping me alive. Now, I don't like it. I want to keep going to get the answers, but at least gave me that, like, oh, my body's on my side. This is not a fight I'm having with my body. And things really obviously change from a central nervous system perspective just from that. And that's one of the most common things we hear with lab work now in our groups. So people are like, I'm just so relieved to understand what's going on and why my body's been doing it. And like I can just be at peace with myself. And that's really important. And so this is where then I started asking better questions. What is it that I can support my hypothalamus with, right? And some of our favorites that have stuck around are things like the lion's mane. We really like the 4-sigmatic blends that are in the packets. They're pretty high, like they're 1,500 milligrams in a packet. So it's not a small, sometimes I've heard people be like, oh, those 4-sigmatics are expensive. But when you compare them to what you get in capsules and things like that and the quality, I actually just continue to buy the 4-sigmatic powder and I add it to my coffee. And there's different ways to use it depending on what your symptoms are and what your labs are and things like that. But lion's mane can be very, very supportive for getting the central nervous system to chill out all of the inflammation, the stress response, the damage going on from that, and begin to bring balance to the brain chemistry that's created, how are the cells talking to one another, and beginning to bring more of a balance to that conversation. And then things like holy basil continue to build on that. I love the tea, but there's also this herb farm holy basil tincture that I personally always have stocked, and that's in our full script too. That is protection and resiliency for the central nervous system from a lot of those compounds that can get created as a byproduct and things that we're exposed to, oxidative stress and damage and compounds. People say toxins as a global, but things in the environment that we can react to, and that's not the same for every single person, though of course there are things in the environment that predictably cause a response, and we need protection from those things, because Megan and I are of the opinion, like, we could all get super duper organic and go live in a cave, but like I don't want to do that. So really, I'm not going to isolate myself. What I want is to understand how to give my body what it needs to protect me and it from living in the world, right? And so it's not like I have a problem with what's happening. I'm more like, cool, what do I need to do about it? The same way that when I go out in the sun, I'm like, I just get sunscreen or I sit in the shade. I'm not like the sun's bad, right? And so I just wanted to sort of clarify that, because I know for a lot of people, they're like, oh, toxins, what does that even mean? And I'm with you on that, right? So let's be more specific when we're talking about all this stuff. So holy basil and lion's mane, that's the kind of stuff that I started really appreciating. For me, that made so much more sense. And then as the years went by and Megan and I started working together, and there was a lot more working with women and learning and working for companies and going to trainings and all of that, I really began to see how common that was. I wasn't some weird unicorn that was isolated. Most of us have top-down issues that are being treated at the bottom level, right? And so addressing it from the top of the chain, super duper important. And that's why even from this part of my relationship with supplements, you see a lot of that stuff remaining. This is also where I learned stuff like how to address metabolism of hormones. A lot of people have heard about breaking down estrogen, but the same thing is true for progesterone. That determines things like anxiety and sleep. The same thing is true for testosterone, determines things like acne, hair loss, low libido, that kind of stuff, low energy, low muscle mass. And then breaking down cortisol. Are you keeping it active or are you inactivating? How depleted is your body, right? There's all of these other pieces of information that we can have, and a lot of people are missing those clues. And so I had experiences where I read about DIM, right, for estrogen detox, and that's in the cruciferous veggies. And I was like, hey, cool, I can get DIM. I have stuff. And I had actually even had blood work from before that said my estrogen at that time was lower than progesterone. And so I was like, hey, cool, right? That was the beginning of this stage. Then over time, though, I began to really see, especially with learning the Dutch and seeing thousands and thousands of the lab work, because I was a consultant as well. So it wasn't just who Megan and I worked with, but working with other providers and all of their patients. I began to see over time, you could get so much more specific on it, right? So people throwing DIM at the situation, there became a lot more questions from, I was like, I actually took it all month long, but for me specifically, that probably only applied some months and only in the second half of the cycle. So it just depends on each individual, right? And then there are other options like sulforaphane that are different compounds in cruciferous veggies that are better suited at times of low estrogen and you still have to work on the metabolism rather than a high estrogen and you have to work on the metabolism. So all of these tools really became much more specific. And at the same time, I began to see global trends, right? So just like how the brain responds, and that's really common because stress is really common. Hello, life. Then the other flip side of the equation was seeing things like how are mitochondria in the body reacting for every single cell? Because I began to ask, I was doing so much for regulating the signal that was getting sent out and the hormones being made, but then I started to ask things like, can the cells even hear it? Right? And that's where things like mitochondrial support and compounded supplements, like one of my favorites is Mitocore, mitochondrial support became a really big category that I spent years going down that rabbit hole around. So this time was great for a lot of that stuff. However, one of the things that then happened was very similar to what I did with food. So with food, I realized how powerful it was and that you could get really granular on it. And then I did it so hard. I basically like med schooled it, right? I did it so intensely that it became a stressor and a problem in and of itself. And that's what happened with supplements, is that I was so like everything had to be figured out. It had to be really intentional. I always had to have the right stuff with me when I traveled. If I didn't have something, I'd get really upset. And this is what launched me into part 3, which is called Releasing into More. Okay, so if this was the intentionality and the strategic episode, this one was the release and zoom out moment that I had. And this one, it's interesting doing these kind of big stories as you look back because it's so clear where it was. But when I was living it, it wasn't like one day I woke up and was like, I'm going to change my stance on supplements or I'm going to do things differently. But really, it became problematic in a way that I began to notice. I'm like, this is very powerful, and yet I am misusing it as a strategy because I'm realizing that I am willing to make myself really miserable to make this happen. And then I thought, well, gosh, what is that telling my brain, right? If I'm freaking out about the fact that I don't have my brain health supplements, and I'm doing something that actively changes my brain chemistry to be more stressed out and that, right? That's where I started to say, Alex, you're not, you can't, you're fighting yourself. You're literally, all those great supplements that you are investing in, that you've done a ton of research around and that you understand really well, how well are they working if that's your approach to it? And like I said, it didn't happen all at once. It didn't happen on a specific day. But over time, I began to release the grip of that. And it catapulted me into a very important part. It was a very important phase. And there's lots to learn from it. But this is where I used the least amount of supplements that I've ever used since the time I started feeling not great in my body. All right, so this is a big part coming up. We'll wrap it up for part 2 today, but in part 3, I'm going to explain exactly what happened and just how much I got out of it. This is key because a lot of times people, it in these kind of phases, part 3, it feels like you're not doing anything. Except for like internally you're changing. It's just that we don't have a great barometer of that, and so sometimes you have to wait for the aha moment in retrospect, right? Sometimes not, but for me, that's what happened. So stick around. Part 3 will come out shortly, and I'll dig into what it looked like to release hold of that and find a lot more freedom in it. And of course, that is going to lead us into phase 4, which is where I'm currently in. And you'll hear how the pendulum will swing back towards in the middle, but that's for another podcast episode. All right, my loves, I will talk to you next time.
Thanks for coming out to hang with us on the podcast. It is our goal to transform the way women are treated in healthcare, and we need your help. We need your help to get the word out. We have a lofty goal of 1 million downloads, and we know that as this podcast grows, we're going to be able to reach more women, get more amazing speakers for you, and bring the most cutting-edge information.
If you found these podclasses helpful, please take a moment to text 5 women you know the link to the series. We appreciate your help so much. Can't wait to see you next time.